So we can use statistical monitoring where we have that holistic view and we can compare one site to all of the others on study. Companies that run a large number of trials and have large trials, that's really where central monitoring can be most powerful. Can the value of central monitoring be quantified?
This is where we bridge the gap between innovation and scientific discovery. This is where technology meets science, a podcast by Epsilon. Each episode brings you insights from industry leaders who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible in life sciences. Enjoy, and if you like the series, click that subscribe button. This series is brought to you by Epsilon, a technology company that empowers pharmaceutical and life science companies to leverage open source technology for faster, data-driven decision-making in regulated environments. Welcome back to Where Technology Meets Science. Today we have a guest from Gilead. Welcome, Jenn. It's great to have you here. How are you?
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Jenn is currently serving as an Associate Director within Risk-Based Quality Management at Gilead Sciences. In her role, Jenn advises study teams on implementing risk-based strategies, and she leads initiatives working to develop enhanced technology and processes for centralized monitoring, risk assessment, and site monitoring approaches. We are going to talk today about centralized monitoring and how technology can help address different gaps within the processes. But before we start, I just want to start with a little warm-up questions. What do you like the most about your job?
What do I like the most about my job? It's always interesting. There's always something new to learn. There's always a different challenge every day. And getting to work cross-functionally is also really great, not siloed in this role. So lots of good things.
Okay. You work within risk-based quality management. And I just want to start with the basics. If you could just walk us briefly through the goals of centralized monitoring within risk-based quality management and maybe broader within the whole clinical trial process.
Yeah, sure. So RBQM, our risk-based quality management, is like you said, sort of a broader umbrella way to apply monitoring strategies and risk-based approaches to our clinical trials to help ensure that we have, quality data at the end of the day, so that our analyses are reliable and our patients are protected. And from a centralized monitoring perspective, that's one piece of that broader RBQM umbrella. And it's really looking at trying to identify signals of data integrity and data quality risk early before they become a larger systemic issue. So, and by what I mean by early is we want to identify these signals when they're smaller, right? So traditionally, we likely wouldn't have ever identified these issues so early, but then we can have actions taken that will prevent it from becoming that broader systemic issue. So it's more effective, less costly to address these issues, and traditionally. It wasn't until after database lock a lot of times when we identified some of these problems that we can identify much sooner using technology, using centralized statistical monitoring. And so, whereas in the past we may have had to scrap the trial or reopen the trial to get additional data, now we can much better prevent that from occurring. And so that fits back into RBQM and that broader umbrella by really helping us to focus on critical to quality factors. So as we go through a risk assessment as a part of our BQM, we're identifying what is the critical data for the study. So our primary, key secondary endpoints, the processes like consenting, right? All of these things are critical to our goals of the trial. And central monitoring is one component of that mitigation strategy. So we can focus our analyses on critical data, including participant safety, those sorts of things.
And you mentioned there you can detect certain signals earlier. So what would be those signals within the clinical trials?
Yeah, we can go through lots of examples. One example that I like to use, it's a hot topic for everyone, is related to adverse event reporting. So safety signals where traditionally when, you're doing data point or listing type reviews, even patient profile, these other types of data reviews done remotely and on site by a CRA, when they're looking at the source documentation, you really don't have the right vantage point to be able to identify a site that may be underreporting safety signals. So we can use statistical monitoring where we have that holistic view, and we can compare one site to all of the others on study who are presumably following the protocol, right? We have the same inclusion exclusion criteria, so you should have a relatively homogeneous patient population. I mean, you're following GCP, et cetera. So you should have within a range a relatively consistent AE rate. So CRAs, medical monitors, data managers, they do not have the right vantage point to be able to identify that. They have really critical roles, right? And their reviews are also very important. But central monitoring helps us to have that vantage point so we can pick out those types of signals early. We can also do that at the country or the regional level, where, in the past, certain countries are often identified as having a lower AE incidence rate. And it's possibly, many times due to cultural differences and how we're reporting changes in our medical changes, right? Whether it's a cough, a cold, not wanting to
Yes.
complain. We can pick up on that using these technologies.
So when the first time central monitoring became possible, how did the whole process of data review look like?
Yeah, so it's a lot of what's still happening today. So centralized monitoring really is sitting beside those types of data reviews, many of which I just mentioned, right? So there were listing reviews being performed manually, whether that's by a data manager or a medical monitor. There are queries and edit checks that are issued, right? Either by a CRA if it's a query who's looking at a particular data point. So much more granular view. And traditionally we're doing, from a CRA perspective, 100% SDR and 100% SDV, right? So they're very focused on the very minutia of the data and not focusing on the critical data points and critical processes. So that's kind of where we were traditionally. And when central monitoring, over 10 years ago now, depending on what company, you were working for, that, were more or less advanced in that space, that was still happening, and it still is today. But with central monitoring, we sit that on top, and it really complements those activities, including what our CRAs are doing on site.
And how did it change within the time, and because like one of the problems that I picked up on one of our conversations is that technology didn't really catch up yet within that space. So if you could just talk us through what actually developed, what is actually like improved within that time, and where we still have challenges within this area, within like central monitoring.
Yeah, from a technology perspective, I guess I would say we've all kind of come along together to an extent. There are some companies, the two central monitoring groups that I've helped build have both built bespoke, homegrown tools where we could really customize the views that we're using. But I have worked within other platforms that are more out of the box, like your Clue Points and Jump. And, I think one of the things that's changed is the user interface. So as we have become more advanced, we're enabling a different type of central monitor where, traditionally, or going back, it may have been a data scientist that had to look at those tools because they were much more complex. And now we can train someone more easily to become a central monitor, to interpret those visualizations, because the user interface has gotten so much better, I think, over time. Also tracking those signals over time and being able to understand, if we see a signal for a particular site, 1 month, how is that changing over time? Are we seeing improvement? Is this worsening? Do we need to take additional action? Then, of course, all of the analyses that we're implementing, that has been evolving as well. But I think there's some core analyses that seem to be pretty consistent across the different platform companies.
And what are you working on right now in terms of like development more of those technologies?
Yeah, so a pretty interesting story, and it kind of brings together both my work with PHUSE group and here at Gilead, where one of our
Maybe you
biostatistician.
want to give a little bit more before you jump into give a little bit more background what you are doing at the because you're part of the you co-lead the PHUSE RBQM working group. That's correct.
Yes, so
Um,
FUSE has a number of working groups.
mhm,
RBQM is one of them. I am one of the co-leads of the RBQM working group. And under our RBQM working group, we have about 5 projects that are currently ongoing.
mhm,
We can talk more about those if you'd like to. One of them, to come to the technology piece, right? And FUSE is really an industry-wide. We bring together experts from sponsor companies, from CRO
mhm,
companies, and it's a really excellent platform to have those collaborative discussions about things from technology to how do we implement
mhm,
monitoring on a small trial where it's very different, right? Risk assessments, et cetera. But to speak to the technology piece, our uh, Jeremy Wildfire is the biostatistician who's helping us build our
mhm,
platform here at Gilead. And that's actually been open sourced, which means
mhm,
that it's being built so that any company could come in and use those tools. So those KRIs will get to like key risk indicators, different statistical monitoring tools. So this is really industry leading that there's this open source technology that's being built. And it's not just by Gilead. There's other companies that are
mhm,
contributing to this. If anyone's listening to this and is interested and you have those skill sets of building those kind of tools, they're looking for that collaborative environment to continue to grow. So that open source good statistical monitoring, or
mhm,
GSM as called, is something that Gilead is using and we're continuing to build on and further refine. Right. I think central monitoring is really not a one and done type activity with technology or the analyses we're using. It really continues to evolve with the types of data we're collecting,
mhm,
the endpoints that are critical for studies, et cetera. So that's where we are right now.
mhm. Um, During our conversation before, you also mentioned there were the gaps in your CRA trainings related to current monitoring strategies. And could you tell what are the knowledge gaps that you noticed the most?
Sure, and this comes from, just to give a little bit of background. I
Mm-hmm.
was a CRA, so it's nice to have that firsthand experience on what it's like to be a CRA on site, working with these study coordinators and PIs for the trials, and what it's like to do that job. And having been obviously going through all of
Yeah.
that training and understanding what that looks like, and there really hasn't been significant advancement in the training that CRAs receive from what I've been able
Mm-hmm.
to glean. And part of the evidence of that is that, as central monitoring has become more and more ubiquitous, right? More and more companies are using central monitoring. Um, One of the things I did a lot in my last position was reviewing the quality of the investigations that the CRAs were doing for those central monitoring signals. So what happens is that the centralized monitoring team, so the central monitor reviews those signals. They sort of
Mm-hmm.
do a first pass, right, where they're filtering out the noise. We want to make sure that the signals that we're sending out for additional action warrant it, right? We don't want to send everything. We really want a targeted investigation. And so once that goes out, the primary action owner for those signals are our CRAs, because of course they're site facing. And so
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I did a lot was reviewing the documentation that those CRAs provided, right? We all know in the clinical trial world, if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done, right? So we need to make sure, if we say, using our AE example, that the site is at risk of underreporting adverse events, that's a
Mm-hmm.
serious, potentially serious problem, right? That could impact participant safety. So we need to see in that documentation that the CRA has really evaluated the root cause. So using those root cause evaluation techniques, whether that's something like 5 whys, it's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing to question, right? And from that, and understanding the true root cause of what may be happening there, then developing a mitigation strategy with the site. We need them to improve their process. So that whole stepwise approach there is where I see a lot of gaps based on the data I have reviewed across thousands
Mm-hmm.
of these types of signals. And what it pointed toward to me was that our CRAs don't really understand that critical thinking piece that's required to perform root cause analysis to the level that is needed. And I think some of that comes back to, traditionally CRAs are trained in this we haven't gotten to SDR and SDV yet, but the activities that a CRA performs on site is largely the source document review and source data review, which are or source data verification, which is just transcription checks, making sure that what's in the source matches with the EDC, not really a quality check. And so it's very sort of checklist type driven training that CRAs receive. I think that's gotten a little bit better with some critical thinking training, but there's still a gap in the quality that we see of these actions that are taken. And what I like to say is, it's only half the battle getting these signals identified. If we identify them and don't do anything about it, they're worthless, right? So we need to make sure that the quality of those actions being taken as a result of our central monitoring signals is there too. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for our CRAs to grow and learn in that space, and really ensure that the quality of the data at their sites is there.
So how can you address these challenges with those knowledge gaps?
There's lots of ways. I'll give one example, but some of the different associations that CRA is a part of, having targeted training for this. One thing that I am hoping to influence myself, again, through the PHUSE platform, one of the projects that we have under the RBQM working group is what we call end-to-end RBQM education. And so that's one opportunity where we can develop CRA-focused webinar, these kinds of things to help them really understand all these things that we've just been talking about, right? And the importance and the impact of what their role is doing. And it's so critical. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite examples of what I'm talking about is raising a signal for potential underreporting of adverse events. And the CRA said, the response is, the site says they reported all of the AEs. That doesn't tell you anything. In fact, they likely didn't do any root cause evaluation. They certainly didn't put any mitigation in place. And that's really not adequate or even an appropriate response. And that's pretty common. So helping CRAs understand that through platforms like these webinars, companies need to get on board too if they haven't already, and really work with their CRAs. I think as a sponsor company, we have an obligation to ensure that's happening, right? And oversight of the types of feedback that we're getting, like I was just talking about. So my company ensuring that the documentation of our signals we're sending out is adequate, and teaching our study leads to review that as well so that they can discuss that with their CRO partners. And I think just having been on the CRO side for so long, I know that when the sponsor is focused on something and talks through this, it makes a difference on where the focus lies at the CRO side. So lots of different avenues there I think we could take.
Before we go more in depth into technology, I also want to ask because obviously centralized monitoring is not, it's becoming more ubiquitous, but it's not in every single company. And then there's still so many more to embrace this approach. So what would you why would those companies why those pharmaceutical companies should implement it within their processes, and then how to do it? What kind of considerations to take into, what kind of considerations to think about?
Yeah, great question. And it's funny because these types of approaches have been in ICH GCP over a decade, and FDA has aligned with that for over a decade. And yet we're still sort of working our way up to alignment with that. And it is company specific, how far along they are. Certainly building your own central monitoring function. There's a cost component there, right? So there's lots of opportunities to outsource this to CRO partners. I worked across hundreds of clients, right, from the CRO side who did exactly that. Other companies like Gilead, and we're building our own internal central monitoring function. So depending on the specific company's needs, wants, and what their ways of working are, those are certainly two both viable and great options. Also thinking about, like we discussed, if you're going to bring this in-house, do you purchase an out-of-the-box system that can be more expensive, but it's ready to go? Or do you build something yourself or use something like the open source GSM that's now available? So those are the kind of things that need to be considered. And certainly among those considerations, how many trials are you running, right? And what is the
Mm-hmm.
size of the trials? Because central monitoring, I mentioned one of the other FHUSE projects is running RBQM and central monitoring on small
Mm-hmm.
trials. If it's a company that mostly runs small trials, there are different challenges there with implementing these kinds of approaches. But companies that run a large number of trials and have large trials, that's really where central monitoring can be most powerful, right? Because of
Mm-hmm.
just the nature of statistical monitoring. So those are the kind of things I would think about. And certainly if someone was going to, or a company was going to implement an internal approach, really thinking through change management, like any other process, it's critical and you need to bring people along. So even if you're building a central monitoring specific function, you need to ensure that you're engaging with the other functions who may not be directly involved in central monitoring, but peripherally. So for example, they may be responsible for actioning things, right? If it's a medical monitor, they need to understand, why am I receiving a signal from the central monitoring team? What do I need to do about that? And help those other functions understand the power and the benefits to their studies, versus seeing that as something that's just additional work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing certainly generally is taken away when we add
Yeah.
new processes.
And like personally, what was the biggest challenges for you because you were building the centralized monitoring for the CROs over like the very long time of your career. So what were like for you the biggest personal challenges within that?
I would definitely say what we've already talked about, which is that the CRA and quality of the actions
Mm-hmm.
taken, because again, it's great to be able to identify these things, and we're getting very good at that. But we just as importantly need those actions to be of the quality that will ensure that the appropriate actions are taken.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and you run into a broad range of personality types and people who understand central monitoring, people who really see the value in it and embrace it. And then, like any change management effort, you have folks on the other end of the spectrum, and you really need to help bring them along, building your change champions so they can help those other functions. Here at Gilead, one of the things that was very helpful, particularly, was our medics, our medical monitors, study teams.
Mm-hmm.
For good reason, really, they're strong influencers on a study team, right? They have lots of expertise, and so they're very well respected. And gaining their buy-in is huge. So that's been a real success for us, is really engaging with our medical monitors as well as our study leads and data management. So that's made a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And how does the technology help to make it more effective?
Great question. So there's a lot of different approaches that different systems take, but really it's that communication piece.
Mm-hmm.
So using a system where, when our central monitors are identifying these signals, they're sort of triaging them to require action, or saying, no, I'm filtering this out. This doesn't really warrant any additional action at this time. Making sure that that signal or that description of the issue, right, the potential issue, these are signals for the most
Mm-hmm.
part, they need to be confirmed, is communicated clearly and effectively to the action owner. So our system directly notifies internal action owners, and because we're a sponsor side and we need to communicate those signals to our CRO partners, they are being transferred to the CRO's CTMS system. And the nice thing there is that it then becomes a part of the CRA's regular site management process. So it doesn't require a separate system that they need to go to
Mm-hmm.
identify what needs to happen. It's already embedded within their normal ways of working. So from a technology perspective, enabling all of those steps and that communication flow, I think is really important.
So there's a lot of automation involved as well.
Yeah, and getting better and better.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've said, building from ground up, and so we're working on all of those things. Other systems have different methodologies for that, automation, et cetera. But yes, certainly automating that transition into CTMS. Sending those signals. We're working on automatic receipt of the documentation that what the CRAs have done, like we've been talking
Mm-hmm.
about, so we can really evaluate that. So many opportunities for automation, AI, a different piece, right? Learning from the signals that we've identified, of those signals, which have actually identified a true underlying issue, right? So if we identify that site who's potentially underreporting AEs, it may be valid. They may have a very
Mm-hmm.
high quality process. It just could be that their patients are having fewer changes in their medical history than other sites. And so, um, if we're raising these signals and we can learn from that, right, using AI to help us learn what is a true issue and what is not, we can fine tune the signals that are being generated and sent out, right, and then eventually predict, use predictive modeling to identify where we think the problems may be. So that's the next step. We're not quite there yet, but something like that also, again, relies on the quality of the documentation, right? Did we identify an issue? That needs to
Mm-hmm.
be documented. So that's a challenge right now, I think, for any company implementing central monitoring.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of AI, like, are there any particular challenges that you see within implementing those AI models? Because in a previous conversation with Vincent from Roche, he actually mentioned that because we do assume that we're gonna feed the algorithm and they're gonna do the work for us and do all the decision, but like we forget that there is a lot of like learning and then a lot of like that specifications that humans and then like people who have been working within clinical trials, they already have that knowledge, so we don't have to implement that knowledge into the professionals, whereas like AI might not necessarily understand the broader domain knowledge. So do you see like some challenges within that, or
I mean, I'm not an AI expert by any means, but yes, I think the learning piece of teaching AI how to differentiate between a signal
mm-hmm.
that's meaningful and is not, you certainly would have to put time and effort into that learning model. Um, and then, there's certainly a lot of work to make sure that that's accurate. And I think there always needs to be, as everybody keeps saying, a human in the loop, right, to do quality control over those types of reviews. But there's small steps that we can take, particularly for certain types of signals. So, for example, when we talk about KRIs or
Mm-hmm.
key risk indicators, I
Mm-hmm.
tend to define KRIs as more simple type threshold based checks.
Mm-hmm.
For example, looking at compliance with critical lab samples. If your primary endpoint, is in virology and you have a lab sample, that's your primary endpoint data. A KRI to identify site process issues can look at, were they compliant with collecting those samples in the first place? We could also look at, was the quality of those samples sound? So could we even get results from those samples that they did collect, right? There's all these different components that you can look at. And I think with AI, particularly with the collection compliance, there's a use case there for partly related to a broader problem. I think in clinical trials is identification of protocol deviations, where we have lots of gaps commonly. This
Mm-hmm.
is seen it across most studies that I've worked on, which is probably hundreds and hundreds at this point. And the data is there, right? But we're relying on these old processes that are inefficient to identify them, still expecting CRAs to identify every protocol deviation, which makes no sense, right? Because we can programmatically look for most of these.
Mm-hmm.
We're taking a sampling approach. So CRAs are no longer looking at every single data point on the study, which is a good thing. So let's remotely look at that. But from an AI perspective, you can use these KRIs when a site is flagged. You could look to see, have all of these deviations been reported, right? And if not, we need to
Mm-hmm.
make sure they're reported. If they were reported, what did the CRA do, right, during the identification of those individual deviations? What was their quality of the mitigations that were implemented for those individual instances where the lab sample was missed, for example? And that can help us do that initial pass that, instantly, right? Whereas right now we might have a system we can go look to see where the deviations reported, but it's somewhat time consuming for a central monitor to do that manually. So that's just one thing that pops to my mind of where you can certainly increase efficiency using
Mm-hmm.
AI. So.
And do you mostly do build those tools in-house, or do you outsource some of the stuff? Do you use open source? Do you use some off-the-shelf solution? Are there any off-the-shelf solutions? You mentioned that they are, and you can actually implement this. It's like, how do you approach this at Gilead?
From an AI perspective?
No, from like general perspective, implementing technology and building those central
Oh, yeah.
monitoring
Yeah, we're building
infrastructure.
in-house. So we're building
Mm-hmm.
the open source GSM is what we are using. We're building tools that can be used in parallel by our
Mm-hmm.
central monitors to investigate those signals. So, a deeper dive into the data associated with that to really have the understanding, like you were mentioning, right? Having this cross-domain understanding where,
Mm-hmm.
for example, having worked as a CRA, also was a study coordinator working on the site side, and I've worked in data management. So looking at a signal, I can think through, is the potential root of this related to something that the site is doing? Has the CRA missed something? How do they address this? Is data management, should they be looking at this data from a different perspective and really evaluating all of those components to see, okay, what should happen now? Who should do what to
Mm-hmm.
investigate this signal? So that's a tool that we're building to help give our central monitors some visibility into that. Of course, some of it comes from experience as well, but so.
Let's talk about the working groups and then open source. Like, what in your opinion is the biggest impact that those working groups are bringing into that particular field, and what were the like, maybe if you could share some projects that you were the most proud of, and what was the impact?
Sure. Well, central monitoring has my heart. So we one of our projects, we've now sort of morphed into this end-to-end RBQM education. What it was a central monitoring project that I was one of the co-leads of, and this kind of showcases the value of PHUSE in general, and
Mm-hmm.
it's that cross-industry collaboration, right? And having all these different perspectives and minds from different types of companies, different size companies, independent contractors, right? Coming together to have these roundtable discussions. And some of the deliverables that came out of the central monitoring project were 2 white papers. They're on the PHUSE page if anyone's interested. And we were looking at both, because a big question that comes up is, can the value of central monitoring be quantified, right? When companies are, back to our
Mm-hmm.
conversation about deciding whether to implement central monitoring or not, a lot of times companies just want it to be a cost savings exercise, but that's quite difficult to prove cost savings when you're implementing a new department whose focus is on quality. Um, and so that was one of the white papers, and sort of the summary of that was, it's quite difficult to do that. And so, you can do certain things that are
Mm-hmm.
indicators of cost savings, but it ultimately, it's all about quality. And that was really the consensus across all of the different companies that were contributing to that. And then the other was looking at, so one was the quality, and then, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Go on.
Yeah, so the other one was looking at challenges of implementing
Mm-hmm.
central monitoring. So some of the things that we've been talking about. And that was really nice to have the perspective of other companies and experts in the field talking through. And a lot of it's very similar, right? You really see these same kind of patterns because human nature, right? And change management and all of the same challenges that we face when trying to build a group like this. So that was really meaningful to me to be part of that group. And now having that morphed into, so we really felt like we had addressed the big questions in central monitoring. It's very clear the value from a quality perspective. Yes, it's difficult to prove cost savings from central monitoring, but morphing that into this end-to-end RBQM education project is
Mm-hmm.
because now we're able to do some of the things like we've been talking about and really focusing in on specific areas to have those conversations. And so we're trying to set up those webinars, which is our primary deliverable with that group, having, yes, a presentation that kind of sets the scene for the topic at hand, but then having a round table and open, Q&A with the entire audience so that you're getting kind of a multi-view into the topic. So for example, one was looking
Mm-hmm.
at safety data. I am interested in right now, one of the things that I'm interested in is looking at, the SDR and SDV sampling and looking at a very specific, China
Mm-hmm.
is still coming along in this evolution of how we monitor. And we have a group here internally that is working on RBQM in China. And I brought it up with some of the other PHUSE members during a community meeting, and there was a ton of great discussion around this. So I'm working on a survey right now to see where other companies are at with how they're monitoring in China. Is this really a regulatory requirement, which is not? I did confirm that much. So what is the root cause, right? What do we need to do to bring this along? And it's, I imagine, a lot of change management, right? And changing hearts and minds about where we get value there. So that's really interesting. Risk assessments, I mean, that's really the backbone of RBQM, right? And so one of our projects is looking at risk assessments, and I can't even tell you, the engagement on that group has been so amazing. Speaking of AI, one of the entire conversations we had was, how do we leverage and teach AI to do risk assessments, right? They're typically quite timely. They require the entire cross-functional team. So how can we make that more efficient? How can we leverage AI to make better use of the team's time? So identifying those risks in the protocol, and then allowing that discussion to happen without everyone having to manually go through and do that. And also learning from other studies, right? So you might be lucky if you have a study lead who has worked on a very similar study previously and has those lessons learned. But AI could do that for us regardless of whether or not someone has run a similar trial before. So the risk assessment group is looking at that. Those are our big ones. And we have a QTL. We haven't talked about QTLs yet, but quality tolerance limits is another one of the projects. They're finishing up a white paper. So that'll be really interesting to hear about. That's QTLs are a broader study level risk. So whereas our KRIs and CSM, the statistical monitoring, is typically, you do look at study level trends, of course, but its primary focus is on the site level, maybe down to patient level, depending. But QTLs are at the study level. So looking holistically at the study, are there systemic issues in these critical to quality areas that could ultimately make or break the trial? So one of our projects is looking at that as well. So that should be interesting.
And when do you plan to release those webinars, those trainings and the webinars? What is the timeline for this?
Yeah, they're kind of planned out. We have a plan, but they are scheduled about a month in advance. So if you go onto the PHUSE website, there is an events page, and you can check out there. And if you want to become a member of any of those projects, most of them, except the QTL project right now, are open for new volunteers. So you can find that on the PHUSE page too.
I'm definitely going to share those in the show notes for our conversation. We're slowly running out of time, but I want to ask you the last question that we ask all of our participants. What is the problem in your field that you're surprised that has not been solved yet?
How many minutes do I have?
I'll give you 5.
Yeah, I'll give you 2 answers. Okay. We kind of talked about one, which I think the protocol deviation is an issue across industry that I've seen, that I'm surprised that we haven't really addressed that yet. But 2 other things I think are really key. One is related to real-time data review. So we talk about this. People will say real-time data review, but there's no such thing. They're really not by a human. Unless the data is being collected by, a wristwatch or some other real-time data collection. When we're talking about doing listing reviews or central monitoring, some people will say real-time data review, but you generally have to wait for the site to enter that data, which sponsors can ask for that to be entered in 2 days, but that does not happen, right? And then you have to have the review occur after enough new data has accrued. So I think there's a lot that we can do there. I think this is still, with all of the technology at our fingertips, and I think we're talking about all of these continuous data capture, and it's happening, I'm sure, in some studies. I don't see it very broadly yet, from at least I haven't, could be wrong there, but the studies I have worked across have not leveraged it too much yet. But I think we could be much better about reviewing this data in closer to real time, so that we, again, come back to that goal of central monitoring, which is to identify these signals when they're small. And then the last one that just still boggles the mind a little bit, and I'm hoping that we can help break this down a little bit with our BQM teams, is these silos that we work in. So, you've got your data management, you have your medical monitor, you've got your clinical operations team, amongst others, and everyone's working separately. And when you actually drill down to the details, there's a lot of overlap in what these functions are doing. So there's lots of opportunity there for efficiency gain. Some Transcelerate actually has a template for an integrated data review plan, where instead of having a separate DQRP, for data management or safety management plan, et cetera, there's one document, so everyone can actually see what everyone else is doing. It's very clear, transparent, and you avoid that duplication of effort. And we're starting to work on a document actually that's pulling together all of these functions to understand so that they can see, oh yeah, they're looking at this too. Let's figure out who's the right person at the right time to do this interview. So that's another thing that I just think we're working on little bit by little bit, but the more people who start to see clinical trial teams and these study teams as a unit, as one team, than these separate silos, I think that will be really beneficial overall, and how quickly we can bring these drugs to market and study drug data quality, et cetera.
Yes.
So,
and I think a big part of it, a big role is played by all the different working groups like PHUSE and pharma that are actually bringing those people across different companies, different roles and experiences together to solve those problems together and work on the same issues. Thank you so much, Jen. That was very insightful. You're very passionate about the topic, and I keep my fingers crossed for all the future projects. I'm going to definitely share all the materials that you mentioned in the show notes. Have a lovely day, and to all our listeners, thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for having me, Nat. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening. This was Where Technology Meets Science by Epsilon. If you know someone who might enjoy the episode, share it with them and subscribe to never miss a new episode. At Epsilon, we empower pharmaceutical and life science companies to leverage open source technology for faster data-driven decision-making in regulated environments. Until the next time.